And
Great.
Stephen's on board, so that's most of our regulars, but we're missing Nina. Well, has an additional commitment on Wednesdays now, so she comes as she can. And then she can pick up the recordings later.
So this is, we're going to do a short review of what we covered last time. The only real change I made in this thing was the last time this was a 26 real dimensional universe. And that's still where we're going. There's going to be 26 dimensions. But I put in this word symplectic because it's going to turn out that the dimensions are paired so that of the 26, one of them is going to be real and one of them is going to be imaginary. That is a real dimension multiplied by the square root of -1. And they'll be paired up in that way. Now, I didn't make this up. I'm just telling you what it is. So just bear with me and we'll see what's going on. And so what we saw last time was there was a bunch of observations that were made by Leadbeater and Besant in the nature of the atom that led to these things called subquarks. And then there were other observations that were made that led to the discovery of what's called dark matter, which matter only makes up 5% of the universe. And of that 5%, just so you put it in perspective, probably 99% of that is in the stars, okay? And the rest is in the planets. And so then when you get to us, we're just a small fraction of that 1% that's on the planets. So we're like nothing. But then we get to the dark matter, which is 27% of the universe. And then we came up with this dark energy, which is 68% of the universe. And so it goes. And then the key thing is what Ron discovered, which was the role of information and how information controls everything, all of the forces, all of the particles. By the way, I just added these dates. It looks like Ron started really doing these observations in 1985, right up till when he passed on. So I just put that in. And the other ones are what they are. The key thing to keep in mind is Leadbeater and Besant were looking at what we call subquarks, which is matter, but they never ever in their observations saw what was called dark matter. That's what Ron observed. He observed both matter and dark matter subquarks, and so it goes. So we have those sort of observations, and then we have some theory. So partly the theory started with Newton with 3 spatial dimensions and 1 for time, which led to this theory of gravity. That got expanded by Einstein into 4 space-time dimensions. They're coupled in a certain way. Then Einstein was approached by somebody named Kaluza in 1919 who added 1 more dimension and was able to get not simply gravity, but Maxwell's equations, electromagnetism, which everyone couldn't figure out unless one of these dimensions was a dimension we couldn't see. And that led to this thing being called a compactified dimension, or a very small, teeny dimension wrapped up around one of these other dimensions. And that appears to be what the case really is. And so 2 mathematicians came up with a description of these compactified dimensions, or compactified manifold. And then we had 2 key theoretical activities, one by Richard Feynman, who was one of the great physicists of the 20th century. And he tried to figure out what was, if you really had a quantum particle called a graviton that carried the force of gravity, it could only have spins that were integer numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And he showed that you couldn't have a real theory for spin 0 or spin 1. It was only starting at spin 2 that you could have a quantum theory of gravity. And based on that, this other guy, Lovelace, carried out some calculations and saw that the only way you could have this spin 2 graviton was in a 26-dimensional space. and he did this in 1971. There's really been no progress since then. There's been a huge amount of math done in string theory with 10 and 11 dimensional spaces, but that is what it is. And again, the key thing here is the observations that Ron made on information in these compactified dimensions, which is controlling everything. And then I just put in here free will. So why did I put in free will? Because
You felt like it.
Because it looks like the following, that you have these souls that are running around, and for whatever reason they choose to incarnate. So when they incarnate at a particular point in time, when your baby has its first breath, when it's in the popping out, at that instant, that actually fixes the birth chart of the natal chart, the astrological chart associated with that person. And that means that there's different planets and stars out there that are going to be influencing this person going through life. And so that'll, in general, well, the planets, the stars, meaning things like the sun that are close by, will have an influence because they each have their own characteristic archetypes that shape things. And you, when you're born, you start to get shaped by these things, but you still have the freedom to act. You have different choices you can pursue, and some of them are better than others, but it is what it is. And then when you die, then your soul disengages, and you go back to unity, toward the great unconscious that is with everything.
May I chime in?
So we'll let Marjorie chime in.
Marjorie, before you chime in, I just want to ask a question that might be relevant to what you're chiming in. Starting this at birth, having this moment of birth be the deciding factor as to all of these astrological things doesn't deal with any concept of life in the womb. And so that there's this moment of birth where things are set in motion, and I find that kind of curious that there's nothing I've heard of that is pre-birth.
Well, Hindu astrologers do actually work with a conception chart, and Hindu women feel that they can sense the moment of conception. They're more attuned to their bodies and so on. And their marriages are often arranged by astrologers, and then they are often trying to plan the conception and the birth. Western astrologers feel that the first breath is the moment of commitment, the commitment of the soul to the earth plane. That's when we start really engaging and acting on the earth plane, is with our first breath. There's different thoughts about when the soul enters. From what I've read, I personally tend to go along with the 3-month theory, that it happens at around 3 months, which is considered to be the time of quickening. And there are even laws about abortion and so on, that 3 months is considered to be a kind of significant demarcation from it being a zygote, and just a group of cells that are attached to the uterus wall, and when it becomes a viable individual entity. So I would say it's really kind of a continuum. And I don't know, the older I get, the more reservations I have about abortion myself, but I don't feel, I still feel that's a woman's individual moral choice to be making. And that's why she's the one in humans, you know, that carries the fetus to maturity. In seahorses, I could tell Bart, he's a seahorse dad, you know, because in seahorses, it's the males who bear that burden, you know, but have that connection as well. So I think it's very sacred, very, very spiritual, and very individual. And I used to be a lot more, you know, matter of fact about it all. I had a friend in college, and I think it was after college, but at some point she told me that she had had something like 5 abortions.
Wow.
And I remember being very disturbed by that. And then thinking, well, if I'm disturbed by 5, why am I not disturbed by 1? And, you know, I'm thinking really deeply about that. And, you know, I guess I felt, well, you know, once can be a mistake, but I think 3 or more is kind of a habit. And it became more disturbing to me. And then I started to understand the question that people are asking when they say, well, who gets to say? And I guess I still feel it's the person carrying that life form. And that's part of why she was, you know, elected to be the one doing it. And that there's a deep contract there, I think, between the 2 souls. And it's a very mysterious, complicated thing to me. But I subscribe to the first breath school of thought. You know, but then the question comes up, well, what about cesareans and things like that? And people have looked at that, and you know, that's an interference. Normally, the labor process is triggered by something released in the it's a fetus at that point, right?
Right.
It's not an embryo anymore, but it's the fetus's decision or so on. It's thought that triggers the mother's labor process. So it's some kind of a hormone that's released, or you know, an enzyme is released when the fetus is ready. It signals the mother's body to begin the process of labor. So you know, new discoveries keep bringing in new questions. You know, here's where science meets spirituality very deeply. The idea of the Catholic Church didn't consider it to be a mortal sin to get an abortion until the discovery of the stethoscope, which was, you know, relatively recent. It was like 18 something. And until then, they didn't realize that there was a heartbeat that could be heard at this early stage. You know, so it wasn't a good thing to do. It was still a sin, but it wasn't a mortal sin like murder. So the church has changed its position too, which a lot of people don't realize. So it goes both ways. Science, you know, streams back into religion, and religion, you know, I think has also influenced science. So it's cultural, really. Ultimately, all of it is cultural.
Well, I have memories just before conception, and memories in the womb.
Wow.
So
Well, tell us about what were those 3 stages.
Did Ron
like?
also have those? Was Ron? Did Ron?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, Bruce and Ron were twins.
In support of Bruce, I've gotten very comfortable over the last many years that there is a planning process that precedes conception. And I've also gotten very comfortable with the fact that a so-called soul is composed of different parts, and different parts, once they go through the process of birth, life, and death, go back to the overall soul to report. And this is just this is where I've gone with my investigation over the last 55 years. And I think that there's a plan that's developed. You go in, and this goes back, Bart and Marjorie, I think I wrote you about human design some time ago, which complemented my thoughts about how pre-planning goes on. At some point before conception occurs, and then conception occurs, and at the first breath, all of the energies at that location on the planet, caused by other planetary influences, astrological influences, are breathed in to start the plan. But this is in part in answer to the question of, is there any pre-planning before the first breath? And I happen to think there is, just to contribute that to the group.
Right.
Sure.
I feel also that there has to be, and that I don't think, well, and as I'd like to hear what Bruce has to say about his memories. I don't think we just start, at conception or at birth and come in a priori, as blank slates with, these there's so much built in, there's so much, what is it, like sub-rasa programming already there. We're programmed to understand language. We're programmed to create language, whatever the language is, English or Japanese. We're programmed to think in grammar. That's natal, that's preconception, that's sort of built in. I think that's built into the hardware more than the software. But we certainly seem to be souls on a journey, or in a classroom. But I'd like to hear what you remember, Bruce.
Well, the memory of preconception is that my meditation teacher, Namche Rinpoche, and myself were talking about my rebirth, and we were way up in the above, but we're kind of looking down on Earth. And then the next thing that happened was I kind of shot down, straight down to Earth, right into my mother's womb. That's before conception and conception. And then in the womb.
And when was that? Was that at 0, at 3 months, at 6 months?
No, it's at conception. I felt my father's presence in a different way, but I felt a very warm heart connection with my mother. And also I remember, what?
I wanted to ask if you remember Ron's conception and when he entered.
No, I don't. But I remember him being there. So there's really a continuum of consciousness before conception and later, like it was looking down on Earth with Namche Rinpoche beside me was a very vivid clear
Hmm.
kind of consciousness. So it had like tremendous awareness and vivid. And then kind of shooting down into the egg.
I do remember Ron saying more than once to me that he had a teacher, and the teacher told him that there's freedom and then there's will, but there's not a lot of free will. There's less than you think.
Yeah, I was there. He basically did a play on words. He said something to the effect like, if you look at the mind, you see there's lots of freedom and lots of will, but the will is not free. Basically, it's a play on words. And later in my life, I found out what he meant as I figured it out. And that is the conditioned mind. You don't have access to your deeper reality mind. Your free will mind is your reality mind, but it's not like having a self. It's not like you can decide what you want to do. It's like a stream of ongoing consciousness, but it has total awareness, and you understand precisely everything that happens. So in a sense, that's the free will, but it's not free will in the sense of having the ego or a self.
Right. That's a good explanation, Bruce. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Go
If
ahead.
you, according, well, Edgar Casey or Sylvia Brown, we decide when we want to come, where we want to come to on Earth. We pick our parents and we come, who would be best to learn what we want to learn.
Right.
And, you know, whether, and that the soul hovers around the mother anywhere. Their thought is anywhere from 3 months to the time of birth. And that's when the soul enters the new baby, either on the 3rd month or at the breath, but the soul can hover around the mother and go into the baby at any time. Now, that's one, you know, thought.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think Bruce is in sync with you. It's just that in his, he did choose the time and place, and who the parents would be. It just that he did it at conception. That was his choice.
Right. But he remembers. I don't remember, you know,
Right. Right.
any of that. And I think most people don't you know, he's one of a few.
Well, one of the things that the kind of a understanding and awareness that I had when I was looking down at my parents, basically Namja Rinpoche and I were talking about what that whole lifetime was what's going to happen in it. Like it was actually known. It wasn't just a happening out of the blue or something like that. It was very consciously understood. But that kind of understanding is a very deep level of awareness that is just part of the natural mind.
Well, in the kind of circles I was raised in, it's also taught that we forget most of that at birth. As we're growing up, we don't remember that. It's kind of, you pass through the river of Lethe, and it's kind of this merciful forgetting of the karma that you came in, that you agreed to come in to work on in this lifetime, until you start remembering, until you're consciously trying to, and and trying to, become more conscious and make more sense of what's happening, that very often then it's given to you to remember and remember your commitment. But the teaching I kind of came to accept is that we don't usually consciously remember because we're forgetting, and
Yeah.
that things aren't caused. This is a Jungian perspective. Events aren't caused by the planets, it's happening at the same time synchronistically. But the time of your birth is this synchronistic blueprint that kind of gets stamped at the moment of your inhale. That first inhale is the commitment to the contract and the earth plane. So then you're signing up for what was agreed that was going to happen. But what we say, it's not written in the chart. What's invisible is really how you experience it and how you learn from it and how your soul is growing from the curriculum that you signed up for. That's a question of level. And that's not all pre-written. The tendencies are there in the chart synchronistically. The themes are there, you could say, but really the way it gets filled in is developmental, and that's not all written. So, what I came to believe is some of your will is the question of level. Mars can be a lot of things. It doesn't have to be violence, doesn't have to be fighting. Mars is the god of war. It could be other things. It could be willpower. It could be energy. It could be force together with Saturn. It could be discipline and very focused. If it's with Pluto, it's more driven and focused. The sign colors it. The sign is like a gel on a theater light, so it kind of gets filtered by the sign that it comes in through. But they say you choose, the one thing that you do choose is that moment of birth, which our charts show that moment of first breath, whether it was cesarean or not, there is still a moment of first breath.
I have,
Does that answer your questions, Stephen?
well, I just wanted to share a personal experience, and I'm curious as to getting feedback on how this experience of mine fits into the constructs that we've just been discussing. And that is that I feel very strongly that I'm aware of the moment of conception of my daughter. That I don't know how, if that is in fact the case, I don't know how that would fit into any of these constructs that we've been talking about. But it's a belief I hold that is as strong as any experience or belief that I have, because it was that powerful of an experience.
Uh-huh. Well, personally, I would go with that. I don't know of any reason not to. And as we're saying, our perceptions are very important. And what's more important? Some instrument telling you something like that? I just had this weird experience I saw 2 doctors last week and had this blood work coming in, but then some of it was delayed. And I was looking for something to be changing, and it wasn't changing in the direction I thought it would be changing. And both doctors really surprised me. They said, well, pay attention to how you feel. Don't pay attention to the numbers. And then that night, the numbers came in. They hadn't come in yet. and the numbers went with what I was feeling. But I just thought it was interesting that the doctors were telling me to pay attention to how I felt and not the numbers. I think we get too far outside ourselves sometimes, and your feelings are empirical.
I just don't understand how, if you go with the flow that the soul of the baby is making a decision as to who the parents will be and all the rest, I don't quite grasp how my experience would fit into that flow chart. It would mean to me that the soul of this child linked to me at that moment of conception, which I guess I can visit that, but that would be the only way that I would see it fitting into this equation.
Well, you might have been linked before, in past lives for a long time, or before this incarnation. And I would say that these things are probably mutually agreed. And they say that same soul families tend to group together and change roles. That the children have been the parents in the past, and the parents have been the children, and now we get a turn, seeing what it's like to try to be a parent to us all. And it was the other way around. I kind of felt that when I was taking care of my mother, and I wondered if I had been her mother, which it was just kind of interesting. But I felt this in our role reversal, I felt this kind of tenderness for her that I never would have expected in my adolescence. At 14, I was oh, forget it, But at times I thought, well, maybe I was her mother. Who knows? Her mother died when she was 8 years old, so it was long before I was born. And my mother then didn't get to have the experience of having a mother after the age of 8. So it was hard for her in some ways to be a mother to me after I was 8. We've talked about things like that. And so it felt like she didn't get to have that full experience. And maybe I was giving it to her at the end of her life, for the last 8 years or something. I don't know, but it just that came to me often, that I had that kind of maternal feeling for her. I remember distinctly, excuse me if this is too much information, but putting powder on her bottom, and I just felt so much tenderness and affection for her bottom as I powdered it.
Bruce.
My experience is that these levels of awareness are there for everyone, right down to the deepest levels. But basically, hardly anyone ever experiences them. But they're actually realities already. And you find that people who get married and people who are close friends already have a long history of being friends or associated with one another one way or another. So it gets, I've watched some of these things happen, and it gets really complex, not just a little, but a whole lot, because there's so many levels of the reality and that are actually happening all the time, that the mind is always involved in. So it gets beyond complex. It's way beyond any normal understanding at all, because a lot of the things that happen are not normal understandings of why things happen at all. So that's
Right.
sort of what happens all the time with everyone. Like the two of you have had, and I haven't looked myself, but invariably have a very long history over many lifetimes. So it's always that complex, just is.
Mhm.
When we were getting together, we felt familiar to each
Yeah,
other.
exactly.
It wasn't like we were getting to know each other. It was like we were getting back together, and
Yeah, well,
we were actually in the emergency room. And
right.
for Bart, I was having trouble breathing. They were, getting ready to set me up on the cot next to him. But I just felt like it was just so familiar, and it just fit.
Yeah, well, that's actually the reality at different levels of the mind. But normally you just aren't conscious of it or even remember at all.
Sure.
And it was still new and interesting and fascinating. It wasn't like, oh, ho hum. And he was showing me his CV online on his cell phone while we were, waiting in the emergency room. And so I was reading a lot of his list of papers and stuff. And it was just like, yeah, this all fits. And I mean, how many people would think that? My parents were very interested in physics, so it was part of my frame of reference, at least in this lifetime, from as early as I can remember. And it just felt like they would really get along. And I feel like the three of them, knew each other. They would have had wonderful conversations and would have fit. I don't know, just would have fit. A lot of their friends were engineers when I was growing up. And my mother worked at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute. So people think like we're so different. We used to try to rehearse these debates that we were going to have for the class, but we would end up laughing because we always end up agreeing too much.
Yeah, but this is normal.
Yeah.
But that was like our third date. We just looked at each other and kind of knew, like, yeah, this is going to be it. This has been the way it's been. I never really felt that before in my life. But so did we answer your question, Stephen?
I don't know, but I don't require an answer. I was
Yeah.
just throwing that on the table, that's all.
Right.
Oh, Bruce matches, Stephen, what you were talking about. He remembers conception. So,
And you say you remember your daughters, and
yeah.
a lot of Hindus look at that very seriously. They'll do a chart for the moment of conception, and there's a conception chart that's alongside the birth chart. And Hindu couples will try to plan that, and they will have a chart for consummating their relationship. They'll have a chart for their first actual meeting. So a lot of astrologers layer all of that on, and the Hindus do all these amazing computations with harmonics. I mean, it's crazy advanced mathematics that is ancient, goes back thousands of years, and it's said to be extremely deterministic. Western astrology tries to account more for free will. Well, we kind of say like, well, the outline is there and you can color it in with the colors that you want to use.
Well, just to make it even more interesting, the two of you probably planned to meet before you were both conceived.
That's what I told her.
That's what he said.
Yeah, yeah. Then it's highly likely.
Right.
And we think a lot of it was to do this.
Yeah. So.
And it's just strange that we both had read these books like the Tao of Physics and,
Hamlet's Mill
and
R.C. Thompson
Dr.
Forum. And so I'm just going to plug ahead here a little bit. So Leadbeater and Besant observed these subquarks that were made up of, there's actually 10 closed strings here. The physicists call them heterotic to confuse things, but it just means closed. So the strings actually wind around like maybe 3 times from top to bottom, and then you see them kind of spiraling up in the middle, coming up there, and they followed all these things. And we take these subquarks and use them to make up protons and neutrons, and then we end up with atoms and elements out of that. So that was what they saw. Here's another chap in 1878 who saw the same sort of thing. He didn't know really what it was, but he thought it was, you know, the basic, this is what everything is made out of. This is the most fundamental unit. And I have no idea why there's 10 here. And we'll see in a second that Ron observed that there were, these are all for matter subquarks. Ron observed there were 5 strings for the dark matter, or it's actually called transparent because you can actually see through it, subquarks. And so it goes. But these are just indications that there's a greater plan at work, that this is not an accident. Then we go off to the dark matter side, where we had these observations that the galaxies would fall apart unless there was extra matter in them to hold them together. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And then the observations that all the galaxies and stars are moving away from one another that Edwin Hubble saw in 1929. And these other guys got the Nobel Prize in 2011 for showing that not only were they moving away, but they were accelerating as they were moving away from us. And so that led to the summary of all of the things that Ron observed here. So first thing was he duplicated all the observations of Leadbeater and Besant for these subquarks with 10 strings. And
I just
then,
want to say 10
Yeah.
would correspond with Kabbalah.
right, the 10 links to the tree of life, the 10 Sephiroths in the tree of life. So the Kabbalists saw this too. They just didn't know how to interpret it. We're just giving a framework to it here. Then the thing that Ron observed was this information that was everywhere, that was covering these fundamental particles like the protons and neutrons and the electron and these subquarks as well. So this information is there, and it's always scanning to see what's changing around it, and then it reacts. But the scans take place in these compactified dimensions, which we don't have any instruments to observe these things, because that was the key thing. Then next of all, Ron observed that the dark matter subquarks had 5 strings, and these, for whatever was going on, Leadbeater and Besant never saw any dark matter. No idea why. It was some quirk due to how they were trained. I don't know. But then Ron went on to look at the dark matter as having 2 forms: a quiescent form that was just literally quiescent. It didn't have any real thermal energy to activate it. And he saw tubes of this that were hundreds of kilometers long in between stars out in space, just floating around. But they would break apart some of these tubes. Pieces of this would land on planets or stars, and they would get energized by the thermal activity, because the dark matter only interacts with matter through gravity. That's all that it can do. So there's a small gravitational tug, and heat is a good way to do that. And so the dark matter was actually sentient. It actually was able to think, and this led to having these archetypes that were on each of the planets and stars, made up of these dark matter sentient entities. And we also saw in Ron's book that all of the chakras were made up of this dark matter, and so it goes. And there's a huge amount of extra stuff that he did at the Big Bounce. So it was not a Big Bang, which we're going to cover later on. So I'm just leaving that out for now. So the first key observation was the electron. And the electron, here we have these 10 strings, but they're wrapped around the electron as he's shown here. And the electron is actually a torus, a donut. There's a hole through the middle. Here's a picture looking down on it. And it's covered with these information blocks that are scanning all the time. And they're also inside the torus. They're not only on the outside. So that was, you can look in all the books you want to, you'll never find a picture of an electron. This is the first one. Then he looked at the strings, and the strings, actually, you label this so they come through like this, but then there's actually a spiral around it. And if you take a look at the spiral, you notice there's a little spiral around that. And if you look at each of these, you'll see the little spiral around that. There's 7 levels to this, which Leadbeater and Besant did observe. So those are what the strings look like. Here's a picture of the proton, which is made up of 9 subquarks. 3 subquarks make a quark. So he shows a down quark, an up quark, and an up quark. Here, 3 up quarks in total. 9 subquarks make up a proton, and they're all vibrating around like crazy. And they actually, he observed that they split into a little mess here where it looks like if there's 9 here, 5 is on this side and 4 is on the other side somehow, and that leads to this funny vibration. Then there were these neutrinos, and the neutrinos, if I took my fingers, so here I'm making the letter O with my thumb and forefinger. Every second there's 100. There's a trillion of these neutrinos per second moving through this little space I've got here. Okay, it's mind-boggling. So what in the world do the neutrinos look like? Well, they're also little donuts. Okay, here's what's going on. They've got their you can see the donut here, but they rotate around. They have the information on them running around in different ways. And here he's got a picture of some of that down here. And so everything is made up of these toruses or donuts.
In the next coming weeks, I want to share a poem with the class that I wrote long before Bart and I even met, like 20 years ago, when I was living in Vermont. And it was in connection with Scorpio, which Bart is. And I talked about a Taurus rising. It was a pun, but talking about the shape of Tauri. Why was I thinking about these things?
Right. And Ron looked at the strings, and it looks like the strings are actually made up of these neutrinos there in these configurations for both, but there's ordinary matter neutrinos that are in some sense bigger than the shadow matter or dark matter neutrinos that make up those strings here. And so it goes. So here is his picture of it. Here's the top is the picture of a matter subquark with its 10 strings. Here's a picture below it of the dark matter or shadow matter, which only has 5 strings. And he just traced one of the strings. So you can see it goes spiraling around down to the bottom, and then it comes up through the middle again. So it's a closed string. There's 5 of them that make up this one here.
So they're really a loop.
Right.
That gets twisted and spiraled.
Right. And the key thing is when you have a closed string like that, it can vibrate. It can, but they're all together, so they make a melody, a harmony out of 5 together or 10 together at a time, and that creates all of the other resonances, all of the other particles that particle physicists discovered in the 40s and 50s and 60s and so forth. The hundreds of particles that are out there that make up the standard model.
So talk about harmonics.
Well, the resonance and the harmonics are key to everything.
Right.
There's only a few of these subquarks, but they resonate in so many different ways that they create all of these hundreds of resonances are all really just coming from the basic subquark. And then Ron looked at a boson, which is a photon, was what he was keen on. And it has this, again, sort of torus shape here with a cross section to it. And he's showing information flowing around the edge, keeping everything going. And so the bosons are the things that create the forces, the electric force, the magnetic force, the force that binds the protons together in a nucleus, and the weak force that breaks off an electron from a neutron to create an electron, a proton, and a neutrino. So that's everything. He saw everything except for this information, which is where he saw these blocks of information. When he looked at the blocks, he saw that they weren't blocks, they were actually stacks of sheets. And then he saw things moving through the sheets, saw these waves moving through the sheets. And when he looked at them in a cross section, he saw all kinds of things kind of balled up, and this thing rolls down. This thing goes around like this, running down here. So it goes. So then he saw these compactified dimensions, and there were 6 of them for each of these 3 subspaces that are compactified. And so one of the dimensions deals with electrons, one with protons, neutrons, quarks, and subquarks. One just deals with the space compartments, which themselves have special rules. The space is an integral part of this, and I'm going to come back to space in a little bit, you'll see. But then there are these dimensions that deal with things far away, like galaxies, or the clouds that are in between the stars, the interstellar clouds, or then the very final one was where he flagged the order of return in the big bounce, that the dark energy that's pushing everything away right now is going to eventually reverse and bring everything back in, and space itself will collapse and will bounce again. And then he has a whole section in his book on these mind forms, which we'll come back to. We're just going to gloss over it here, but he had a basic mind form. These are dark matter subquarks that just bond together and form a little tree like this. Here's the root of the tree, and here's some branches of the tree. And just in a very short period of time, it just mushrooms when it absorbs energy into this incredible fern-like thing that's over here, which is still a tree. Everything is flying all over the place. But the fact that this can become sentient is the mind-boggling thing. So what we came up with out of this was a more complete picture of the standard model here for matter. And this is the standard model for matter. We had these two up and down quarks, an electron and a neutrino. And because there's 3 holes in the compactified space that we have in our space, 3 holes leads to 3 resonances. So each of these quarks resonates into 2 other quarks, and we could replace these with subquarks. There'd be 2 other subquarks that would resonate here. The electron resonates into 2 other types of electrons, and the neutrino resonates into 2 other types of electrons. The 4 forces that are here are really only due to the photon that's here, which resonates and creates these other things here, and gravity, as we'll see, is going to come out of this. And then we have this crazy Higgs boson. So that's what we end up with for our standard model. It's simpler than what we've got. For the dark matter, it's even simpler because there's no electron. So forget this electron thing here. There is none. And the up and down quarks, there's only one type of quark, because the subquarks and quarks don't have any charge. And these things do have charge to them, up and down quarks here, but the actual dark matter subquarks don't have any charge. So we end up with just something like this. But now there's 4 holes in this subspace that's tied to the dark matter. So we end up with not 3, but 4 subquarks, 4 resonances for the there is no electron, but there's a neutron. So there's 4 resonances for the neutron. We still have the same forces here, all due to the photon. And we have this Higgs boson, which is a separate dark matter Higgs boson. So this led to what today is called string theory. And there's, see, 248 particles that you end up with out of this thing. And there's all kinds of things that arise out of this. So you end up with a very complicated theory, but it's actually not as complicated as you think. The one thing that Ron observed was that things are very deterministic, that because of this scanning in these compactified dimensions, that everything is always in sync. They're always scanning, and then things react, scanning, and then they react. And they're using the algorithms that are built into this information that's everywhere. So what that means is that this is what David Bohm, that we saw in the movie last year, where he had a what he called an explicate order, which is the order that we see, in an implicate order. In the implicate order, he said, is due to what he called hidden variables. The hidden variables are what Ron observed, the information scans and responses that make everything come into sync with one another. So there really isn't the randomness that you would think here. Everything appears to be highly deterministic. And just to reinforce that, this is not saying that quantum mechanics is not a good theory, but the thing that comes up in quantum mechanics is that you end up with the so-called wave function. You never really use the wave function other than to look at its magnitude squared, and that's the likelihood of some event somewhere. Well, if we looked at the wave function as it is, it has a real and imaginary part. And what we're seeing here is there's actually the space that we live in, that we view on as real, but the space that the dark matter is in is actually the imaginary conjugate of our real space. So we took the X dimension in our space, and we were able to multiply it by the square root of -1, whatever that statement means. We end up with the space for dark matter. And we do that for the X, the Y, the Z, and the time dimension. And so it looks like the wave function in quantum mechanics actually is in our space, but it flips over in part into the space where the dark matter is, because that's where things are imaginary. And this doesn't disprove any of the stuff that quantum mechanics has come up with, because we have phones today that have transistors in them. We have lasers that send out light. These things are all based and designed on the basis of quantum mechanics. So we're not making any of this stuff up. Then Ron went back to look at the double slit experiment with one electron going through a hole when it behaved like a particle. But when there were 2 holes, 2 slits there, the electron was scanning, and it saw that there were 2 slits, and it magically turned itself into a wave. And I have no idea, that's why we just called it a wavicle. Now, Ron interpreted this thing to be things kind of blowing up like this. The only thing that the electron he saw was expanding as this torus or donut. The only thing I would say is he also saw, though, that the scan and response was taking place, and it could be not so much that the electron expanded, but he was seeing the scan, which was exploding out of the electron all over its surface, just like he's got here. And the scan itself is what is detecting this, and then coming back immediately to let the electron know there's 2 slits there. It's time to become a wave rather than a particle. So that's just my 2 cents. I mean, Bruce was there many times, and I'm just saying, I'm trying to give a different interpretation of what Ron saw, just to be consistent, because he was only really noticing the information really in the year 2019. Okay, it was a later observation than what he'd done before, and so that leads to this basic theory of of what you want to call science. We have this information that controls everything everywhere. And we have one stack here, which is the basic physics made up of these subquarks for matter and the basic physics for subquarks that make up dark matter, two different types of subquarks. That leads to different sorts of chemistries, and that leads to different sorts of biologies that we have there. But this is how everything gets played out in this schema. And then we have all of this work that's been done on these compactified dimensions. We touched on why there's more than just 3 spatial and 1 time dimension in order to actually have a theory that works at the quantum level. The thing to keep in mind here is that we're going to see that there's 3 holes in the compactified space where we are, 4 holes for the dark matter, and then 8 holes in the synchronizing compactified space. So the 3 holes in the matter compactified space have to link up with the synchronized space. The 4 holes in the dark matter have to link up with the synchronized space. So that takes care of 7 out of the 8 holes. So I have 1 hole left over. I'm just going to hook that up to time. I think there's something funny about time, and we'll see how it plays out. And then here is this discussion. I'm just trying to put in, this is impossible to visualize. How I could take an x-axis and pair it with an x-axis multiplied by the square root of -1. I don't know what that means, but it seems to be how the universe works, and so be it. The pictures here, we end up with 2 different time dimensions. I just said, well, if there's only 2, maybe there's another 6 to give us 32 dimensions total. But I'm just playing games here to say what's going on. And for all we know, there might be this actual 196,883 dimensional space that's really underlying everything. We saw as this crazy monster group. So the information has these algorithms that control everything, and they're all driven by these scans, and that's how everything works.
We have a raccoon.
There's these 26 dimensions that we talked about. They have these symmetry groups here that we touched on. There's a different Higgs boson, and Ron actually observed these right right when the big bounce occurred. I pushed him to look for this Higgs boson, which initially has a value of 0. So everything was totally symmetric, and all the particles and all the fields had 0 as a score. There was no mass, there was no energy. But all of a sudden the Higgs boson kicked in, and that scaled everything up and gave everything masses, and the fields actually had some strengths to them for both matter and for dark matter. And that was a key observation. And then we just end up with this type of thing where we have the matter with the 10-string subquarks, the electron and the neutrino, and we have these biological bodies that are born and live and die. And then we have the dark matter, which lives forever, and it's either quiescent or active. And what happens here is it appears that the dark matter lands, because there's so much of it, much more than of matter, onto stars and onto planets and so forth, and it gets energized and active. And our planet had single cell prokaryotes, or which we call bacteria, and the dark matter had a lot of time on its hands, so it was able to gravitationally try and couple to push the prokaryotes, the pieces of bacteria, together, and that created multi-celled creatures, which are called eukaryotes, which is what we are. And once they started doing that, then they kept pushing to create all of the systems that make up a real cell, with DNA and RNA and all the proteins that go with it. So there was an incredible symbiosis, it appears, between dark matter and matter. This is just a discussion on how Bruce has touched on this, that you have duality where you have your mind or your consciousness, and then the soul, the entity that senses the true reality that's around you. So you have these dual things, but if you can achieve enlightenment, then you end up losing this duality. You have non-duality, and you're sensing with incredible certainty, with incredible knowledge of everything going on, which is, another way of saying this is what Ron saw, was he saw things with incredible certainty. But the key thing is that you're probably sensing this wave function that is there. There's only one wave function for the entire universe, and by sensing this, you sense all possible outcomes, and therefore you have this certainty that is there, that is the basis of this non-duality. You can see everything that could possibly happen, but there's a certain path for everything that's more likely, that's a better path, in the sense of what we saw in terms of physics was a principle of least action, that you follow that path. And that leads to why planets run around stars, and why we have the chemistry that we do, and so forth. So what came out of this was, this is a complete description then of, we have the matter, dark matter, and the fields that are there. But there's one more thing we have to remember, is we have space itself. The compartments of space are actually where the game takes place, where the matter hops around from compartment to compartment in space. The dark matter does the same thing. And the fields, which are, again, particles, photons, and so forth, they hop around from space compartment to space compartment. And that leads us to this picture here of 26 dimensions. So we're here in these 4 dimensions, but we're closely coupled to these other 6 dimensions that we can't see. So if we look at this, we have 3 space and 1 time. So down here we have 6 dimensions. So there's probably three for space and 3 other for space, multiplied by the square root of -1, which gives us a pairing with the space dimensions we have up here. Time is itself. Here we have, with dark matter, 3 dimensions for space, and again 6 compactified dimensions. So there's 3 that are dealing with some subspace, and another 3 multiplied by the square root of -1 that give us a total of 6. And then down here at the bottom, we have something that synchronizes everything that's taking place here. So everything syncs up with everything else. Nothing is ever out of sync. And this crazy logic of having these complex numbers. I don't know what it means to be a complex dimension, but it's just what makes sense mathematically. I don't know that you could ever come to grips with this in any way. The other thing that we saw was the study of symmetry here. And we saw in the study of symmetry that there were 18 regular families of symmetry that cover most of the rotations and translations and everyday types of symmetries. But then there were 26 things that just didn't fall into any category, and they were called sporadic or exceptional. And the most bizarre of these was the 196,883 dimensional space that had almost 10 to the 54th elements in it. So you end up with this incredible physicist, Freeman Dyson, who passed on just a few years ago, who said, "I have a sneaking hope, a hope unsupported by any facts or any evidence, that sometime in the 21st century, physicists will stumble upon the monster group built into some unsuspected way into the structure of the universe. If I had to take a guess, it would be built into the cosmological structure. That is the structure of galaxies and clusters of galaxies that are out there and what's going on. But that's just my conjecture. Now, to further confuse things, there's a really great physicist, Stephen Wolfram, and he decided in 1980 to leave physics, and he's never really left it. He's created a company called Mathematica, which markets mathematical software. The software allows you to deal with symbolic structures in mathematics. So you can simply write down algebraic equations and it'll solve the algebraic equations. So instead of saying x plus y equals 2, so therefore x equals 2 minus y, if you did this on a computer, you'd have to plug in numbers for x and y. But his software just allows you to keep the symbols in place to do these things. And he can do an incredible amount of algebraic and calculus and all kinds of integrals. They're very powerful software. So he's developed this, and this led him to spend a lot of time studying computers and the structure of computers and how they came about. Led him to start to think that actually things that you find when you write software, things like we described a tree before as an example of a graph. A graph is just a collection of points that are connected together in different ways. And he started looking at this on his own because he's independently wealthy. He's got this company with hundreds of employees, and it's making tens of millions of dollars a year. So he's going back to physics, and he's arguing that actually there could be a whole underlying structure here based on graphs that would actually explain the actual causality that we see around us. And it wouldn't necessarily be looking at pictures, geometric pictures that we talked about before, but it could. And the thing that came with this is I just wanted to capture what Bruce raised before, that Garshan Rinpoche argued that there was duality and non-duality, and the duality is what we experience, but the non-duality really extends our consciousness up to these higher dimensional spaces, and we lose our duality or self. Did I do that okay, Bruce? Was that correct representation?
Yep, hello.
Okay. We had this underlying principle due to Lagrange of least action, which is used to in all of physics. It's used to describe everything that we can come up with in physics, and string theory is an example, is part of this. And so, but the other key part to it was these conservation laws that were intimately tied to the Lagrangian. If we had a Lagrangian system, then we would end up with a variety of symmetries, and Emmy Noether characterized all of these symmetries here. These lead to conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, and so forth. Conservation of mass, but this led to more equations of rigid body mechanics. And it also led to a road that wasn't taken by the physicists, which was that space itself is probably providing the medium for the photons to hop as light propagates. And the end result was that there's an ether there that actually makes up all of space. And if there is an ether, then we could go back to Maxwell's equations and extend them using notions of fluid mechanics for a perfect incompressible fluid. And if you do this and carry out what's called a perturbation analysis in the where you look at the 0th order term is due to there being the ether having no impact. That's where we get Maxwell's equations. But then we include 1st and 2nd order terms. We get all the other forces that we get in physics, including gravity, when gravity shows up as variations in the ether density. But this was
the occultists always referenced ether as the 5th element.
it is. It's well, and it's the density of space. So, the density of space is pretty thin. It's pretty close to 0, but it's not 0. Okay.
But there's no such thing as really empty space.
No, space is made up of these compartments which kind of form a foam. So the space itself is a foam. It's filled up with foam, and which raises, you have to, you think we're in space. So that's what it is. There isn't any empty anything because it's made up of these space compartments. So this leads to there's only a set of equations for particles, which was due to this physicist Dirac, and they end up covering all the particles we talked about, the quarks and the subquarks, the neutrinos. Then for the bosons, there's really only Maxwell's equations here for the photon. And when we include the ether into it, then we end up with all the other forces that we're worried about. So that takes care of all of the equations. And the only thing different here is what in the world do we do to describe the ether or the quantum space foam? And so that's where we're going to come back to Wolfram. And what Wolfram was saying is the following, that we had in the 1600s Newton coming up with this idea of differential equations to describe gravity. Before that, we had these geometrical elements: earth, air, water, fire. Those were structural. Okay, nothing more to be said. Now, when we get into the 1980s, people came up with the notion of what's called cellular automata. So there's the automata, and they go ka-chung, ka-chung, ka-chung in time, running along with time, going from top to bottom. That's how this was done. And this led him to think of more complicated. Why just have one time thread? Why not have a tree where these things are going ka-chung, ka-chung, ka-chung every which way, and everything's getting updated? And this gives you enough degrees of freedom to describe some amazing phenomena, which he calls the ruliad. This is the rule of rules, encompassing all possible rules. This is what the information has in it, in these space compartments everywhere. And it's also all possible ways. So he can end up with a model of space here. He had it up here in the corner is let me see if I can move this thing. You can see it. Yeah, up here in the corner is a model of a graph of a network that would obey this Lorentz symmetry that we've been kind of walking around and all this stuff. And then Ron Cohen actually observed that these space compartments, especially when the big bounce occurred, you could see that they really were made up as like a graph or a network that was just covered with information. So the compartments of space themselves, he could see a graph. And it was, remember, space is going to be in 24 spatial dimensions. There's still the 2 dimensions for time. And so these things compressed as a graph, and then when we bounced, they would just uncompact. They go kapong, except expanding out. They'd expand out. It's like 30 orders of magnitude, which is impossible to understand. 30 orders of magnitude is a gigantic number. And that led to what we saw was inflation. So Wolfram has a whole discussion on graph models and computational models to describe this. And it appears that he might be onto something, in my opinion, that is going to, be really profound. The thing that's got to be done here is you've really got, if it's 26 dimensional space with 2 time dimensions and 24 spatial dimensions, then there's really 8 3-dimensional subspaces that you have to deal with. And so the graphs you're dealing with are not arbitrary. They have to capture this sort of structure.
I keep thinking of the movie, The Matrix.
Well, it is very like the Matrix. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that we saw also with Ron was I've got his book here. If we want to go back over it, I can, let me do that. So I'll get out of screen share, hold it, and go to, where does this book goes? Is it? Here it is. Okay, so we saw this last time. He had this whole chapter on chakras. And
I love that.
and here's the crown chakra that he made a picture of. This is all made up of these subquarks. So the chemistry here is again subnuclear. It's smaller than the nucleus. So even though this thing looks gigantic, it's actually minuscule. Then we had the third eye in the middle of your forehead with this chakra. Then we had the throat chakra here, which is also incredibly complicated. Then the heart chakra, which is, again, it looks gigantic, but it's very small when you actually look at these things. Then there was a water and fire chakra, which he did again in a different view here. And then the sexual chakra for the male, with the female being very different. And then the root chakra, which he has here, with all kinds of grass-like structures that were running around. And here's an even more detailed picture of this root chakra. So this is all taken from his book, and he's trying to show how the root chakra is related to the fire chakra and to the sexual chakra here in this picture. So he just chose not to dig into these things simply because it was going to be a huge amount of work, and he didn't. The part of the problem you have when dealing with this is, what in the world are you looking at? What is the framework? What is the structure? So you can draw these pictures of these things. The pictures are all correct, but you can't put together a framework like we saw before, where we could have 26 dimensions for space time and play all these geometrical games. There's no framework that we have here that describes how in the world all of these things arise. There could very well be in the Hindu and in the Vedic scriptures, but I can't read Sanskrit. I'm not going to live long enough to figure out what it is, but clearly someone gave a lot of thought to this.
But apparently the chakras function in the multiple dimensions.
Yeah, the chakras are made up of this dark matter. That's why you don't have instruments to see these things. And they appear to be all linked up and down your spine through these compactified dimensions to create this notion of a soul or a spirit that's there, which again is heresy for physics. But
our physical body isn't really inside or outside our energy body, or vice versa. Our energy body is really in another dimension.
Yeah, well, the
inhabits.
energies you're talking about are in these compactified dimensions. That's where you're controlling the actual energies. Okay, and we're here in this four-dimensional space that we see around us. So that was something huge that Ron put together. And I'm just going to go back to this.
Well, I wonder, and Bruce is the executor of Ron's estate, right, and the publisher of his materials.
Well, yeah, Ron has a number of books. And so Bruce is the executor of the estate. I guess the royalties of the books end up going to Ron's estate.
Well, I'm wondering if it would be something useful to do to make a video with like animated versions of some of them, and you doing a voiceover explaining.
Yeah, we talked about doing graphics and video animation, and it's like everything else. Someone has to do the work, and ultimately someone has to get paid for it.
Right.
So Ron had a daughter who's capable of doing it, but it's a huge amount of work to do these animations.
Yeah.
It's
very
and have
labor
them
intensive
be compelling, have them look good, but
to be accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing that comes out of this is that your brain is probably only a resonance resonating with your soul here, and because your soul is what is creating is sensing the true reality around you, and so the mind that you have there is really not a real entity. It's only a resonance that comes about with the soul resonating with your brain, and you can lose that if you can achieve enlightenment. Lose this duality of having a soul and a mind, and there really is only one thing, non-duality, that's going on there. But then you start to realize what's going on in all these other compactified dimensions, and you that's where you end up with this incredible certainty or knowledge of the universe, of everything that's interacting with everything else. So you can achieve, for example, sense what Ron saw in detail, but suppose you wanted to go look down into a proton and see the subquarks that are there. That takes a lot of physical work. Ron was exhausted doing these things to get these pictures, because remember, these things are oscillating like crazy all over the place, and vibrating, and so he had to end up slowing them down, which apparently was exhausting, as well as then holding them there long enough so he could do these drawings. So huge effort. So, and that led us pretty much to the end, I'm pretty sure. The symbiosis between dark matter and matter has been here, for billions of years, and we continue to see it play out. I think, though, the thing that you can't appreciate is that there was probably a billion years when Earth had just bacteria on it, these single-celled creatures, and the dark matter landed on Earth and tried to push the two different types of bacteria together to create a multi-celled bacteria, or going from a prokaryote to a eukaryote. And there must have been, huge numbers of failures. But if you have billions of years to work, if it doesn't really matter like what else is going on, then you can get the job done. And that led to what became evolution, when you can have these multi-cell creatures and end up advancing into very highly sophisticated entities. And then then we went through all of the other powers, the mystic powers of the Yoga Sutras. Ron focused just on the ones involving his clairvoyance and his ability to hold things, to stop their kinetic vibrations and so forth. But as we saw, there's many, many more of these things here. So that is it for tonight. What do people have to say?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I just had a little train of thought listening to you talk about electrons and the slit experiment. And it occurs to me that if the electron is observing the environment and then changing behavior based upon that observation, it could be said that the electron is in and of itself sentient. And if that is the case, one could say that, okay, to be sentient, it would be in one of two categories, I would believe, animate or inanimate. And if it's animate, that would mean that an electron would be a life form unto itself. If it's inanimate, it would mean that something had created a machine that was doing this task. I'm looking for feedback on that little train of thought.
It's inanimate. It's like a little robot. It's just following the algorithm, and the algorithm is saying scan, scan, scan. And when you see a change in something, react on it according to what the algorithm says. You're either going to be a particle or a wave, and end of story. And there's no at this level, there's no real intelligence with the electron. It's just following the algorithms that are built into space-time.
And no, apparently no volition, right?
Yeah. The electron is the only volition the electron has is it's following this principle of least action, so that it knows that negative charges, like charges, repulse one another, and opposite charges attract one another. So it'll act in that way. But beyond that, that's it.
Well, it doesn't really have any choice about that.
No, but that's an example of what the algorithm says. No, and exactly how much you react, how much you push away or attract, is in the bowels of the algorithm.
Thank you.
I'm not so sure about that.
Okay.
Well, the sense that, like in non-duality, what you experience is union is everywhere. Like there's something profoundly deep about the whole thing. I mean, it's beyond comprehension, but it's still there.
Well, I mean, you have a point, Bruce, that I showed the picture of the electron, showed that it had these 10 strings wrapped around it, okay? And it could be that each of these subquarks does in fact have some little smidgen of sentience, okay? It's just that it gets overwhelmed by the nature of the electron being this negatively charged particle, and it has to follow these algorithms or laws that we call electromagnetism.
Yeah,
So
but so does it.
it's not inconsistent with what you're saying.
Yeah, like I don't know. My sense of it is that there's a very deep, profound intelligence of that includes heart, mind, and compassion that is simply everywhere. I mean, nothing's actually separate from it at all. That's sort of my experience. I mean, I don't have an explanation for it, but it certainly is my experience.
I mean, but so it means that, you know, while we look at inanimate things like we have, you know, dirt or minerals or whatever, and then we have animate things like plants and trees and flowers. But really deep down, they all have these subquarks in them with a little smidgen of sentience. So all of these things are in some sense alive and linked together in some way.
Yeah.
Bart, I just going back to this little electron, it just strikes me as, rather than a little deal, a big deal, that this electron is observing the environment, is seeing whether there's one slit out there or two slits out there, and deciding to behave as a particle or a wave. I mean, that seems like an awful lot going on.
Yeah, well, yeah, but Steve, you have this is the artist of all artists. This is the Picasso of all Picassos. You know, I didn't make this up. I'm just telling you what Ron observed. And it's an incredible work of art. The structure that's here is phenomenal. This is not accidental.
Is this, I think it's part of what's talked about in Buddhism with the 10,000 things. And 10,000 is just a number, you know, 10,000 to the power of a billion, you know, that the unity pervades the separation. So it's the observed and the observer, you know, and there's no separation. But it's something I love about Kabbalah is that it says, but the illusion of the separation is where everything's happening. You know, so that without that illusion of separation, it's just a jar of mayonnaise, you know, it's just all one. And the consciousness wanted to experience itself, so it split into the 10,000 things. In order for there to be experience, for there to be an experiencer, there has to be, and that's why I don't think most Jewish people know, but that's why they light 2 candles on the Sabbath as a celebration of the duality or the illusion of the duality, that we can even have such a thing as perception, let alone experience, you know, that there's a perceiver and there's the perceived, and we can look into each other's eyes and see each other and experience that as 2 individuals seeing the other individual and ourselves in their eyes. But we wouldn't have any of that, you know, experience or mystery without the illusion of the duality, because everything depends on that.
The Japanese have Shinto, so there are trees and springs and mountains that they worship for exactly this reason. They sense spirits in these things.
And that they have love also.
Yeah.
And that they're giving and sharing and giving out of love. So the whole act of creation is this wonderful act of love.
Yeah, and that's why people, you know, when you can sense, especially with nature, when you get into nature and you start to meditate and really zone out, you sense this incredible unity that's out there, that is in everything, not the inanimate and the animate, the trees and the bushes and the flowers and then the rocks and all the minerals and on and on.
I just have a question that when Marjorie, when you're talking about the 2 candles, I just had a thought about just the development of religious thinking and behavior that makes no sense to me, in that if the thought is that we humans are one with God, in much the same way that there are, you know, earthquakes and hurricanes and all kinds of things that kill and wound people and are very hurtful, but are not designated as evil, that any human behavior, I don't see it being congruent with the idea of being one with God as behaviors being good or bad or sinful or not. They just are. And if they are, I mean, in much the same way that God is, all of these behaviors are. And I'm curious about what am I missing here in terms of the development of religious thinking in that regard.
Well, I think that whole question of morality has to do with the questions of free will. And it's said that human beings are the only creatures really with free will. That, and this is we're back to where we ended up, last week. The same question: to what extent do we have free will? But it said that even the angels don't really have any free will. We can defy, divine reason. We can defy divine will. We can go into separation, on some level of free will. So that would be, how the morality comes into it, whether you're choosing, I've seen it said that sin is really a state of separation.
Mm-hmm.
And not realizing your oneness with others and the divine. And this is part of why I'm kind of an advocate for awareness of the duality and the separation at the same time as the underlying unity, because I feel that all matters. Not just to sit around and judge each other or judge things, but because I feel it's important to act as if we have as much free will as possible, so that we are using it for the utmost, to the utmost of our ability, for good, for the sake not only of ourselves, but for others, and that our experiences are in some way real. Even if it's an illusion, I think it's an important illusion.
Marge, you said something previously that really got my attention. We always have these polarities, positive and negative, black and white, male and female. And you said something about trying to walk the middle path, in between these polarities that really got my attention. I find that really helpful.
Do you remember what I said?
Well,
Mm-hmm.
it was something to that effect that about walking the middle path between the positive and negative energies,
Right.
to keeping things in balance.
Well, there is a teaching, if we try to just go, toward the light, toward the positive, we're, just sort of as a matter of course, inviting in the opposite. That if you go too far toward one polarity, you're going to be invoking or evoking the opposite polarity, because if you're just facing one thing, there's the back of your head too.
But yeah, we saw in the book of Job that, the question came up, since God encompasses all things, God has to encompass evil as well as good. And so he put Job through all of these trials to show that he indeed have that. But at the end of the day, Job was saved. Job ended up recovering everything that he lost. But the evil side of things, I would view more as an absence of love, not something dark. It was just like zero. There was no love there, and then love came back into the life of Job.
Well, it's also, Jung would say that God grew as a result of his experience with Job.
Right. Right. And
That
that,
Job changed God, not only.
right. Book of Job was one of the oldest books, as near as anyone knows, that makes up the Torah. And what came out of this, according to Jung, was that this was why God created Jesus of Nazareth, was to not go through Job again.
And that the divine felt that I like to get away from this personification. The divine felt that it needed to experience what it was to be human, that it wasn't fair or right for the divine, this completely, let's say, transcendent function to be judging us when we're made finite. So if you're going to program us, to do X, Y, and Z, then you can't blame us when we do X, Y, and Z if you're the programmer. So they say that Job changed the divine's understanding of it itself, and realized that it had to come down into finite human form to experience what it is to be human before he could sit, or it could sit, in judgment of human behavior.
And that's where free will comes in, because God does not have dominion over the world.
Right.
So we have a choice on which path to take, upward or downward.
Right.
Right.
Right. And I choose to feel it matters. If you inflict a lot of pain on a lot of other entities, whatever we are, I don't care if we're just avatars, on this plane, and we're really, brains on a shelf somewhere, projecting these movies that we're buying into. I still feel it matters.
Mhm.
There's been all these discussions about artificial intelligence and artificial, what's it called? Reality.
The metaverse.
Yeah.
Virtual reality.
Virtual reality. And there were people doing these experiments when we were first getting these online communities, and did it matter if you really hurt somebody in one of those group games? I feel yes. If they were really hurt, you're still acting, and a couple of weeks ago, our church put together a discussion on physics after they discontinued our class. And they were asking about, well, what, does it matter if everything is going to end someday? Does it matter what we do? I don't think it makes the least bit of difference that it's all going to end someday. Of course, I feel, of course it matters.
Yeah.
Or we have to act as if it matters. And I think things like, hurting one another, betraying one another, stealing from one another, dishonesty, I think those things matter a lot. Let's say what the Europeans did to the Native Americans. When we came here, I think that really matters.
Right. So, anybody else want to chime in? Anything?
It's enjoyed it very much. Fascinating material. Thank you.
Who is that?
That's me, Barbara. I don't know if you could.
Oh, I see. I got you.
Okay.
I was looking around. I didn't see a face. Okay.
The mysterious voice from beyond.
Yeah.
I came in so late that I don't even know what to say.
But we'll send out the handout along with the
Yeah.
the recording, and you got any questions, we'll go over it. But what I just want to get across the magnitude of what Ron observed, and the power of what the underlying ideas are. So you know,
And his feeling, Nina, was that physics really it should be the domain of Buddhism.
Yes, it is. It very much is, actually. I mean, yeah, I mean,
well,
because-
that's the title of his Kindle book. It's like, let me see. The Path of Love, the Future of Buddhism as a Science. That's
Yeah.
the full title of the book.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, yes, of course. We've been, I mean, in my work, I'm always asked to study physics, which is what brought me also to you guys. But it doesn't mean that I understand it.
No, Nina, I want to get across. We don't understand it either. I'm just trying
So
to.
you seem to know what you're talking about. I certainly, you know, I
Well-
mean, now last year I kept up beautifully. This year I'm so busy.
But all I'm trying to say is that there's structure here, and there's the hand of an incredible artist is at work here to create the structure. But why this structure rather than any other structure? I have no idea. Why are there 10 strings for matter and subquarks and 5 strings for dark matter subquarks? I have no idea where those numbers came from. But you know, someone somewhere said, "Oh, this is the way we got to do it."
If it
Probably
works, it
a lot of
works.
trial and error.
Yeah.
I mean, my teacher says it's just like the Matrix, you know, I didn't know somebody said that in here.
That was me.
And yeah, I mean, I see unity, that I see very clearly. The physics part, I don't know.
Well, the unity is this information in those compactified dimensions, what
Right.
Jung called the great unconsciousness that
Yes,
links
yes,
everything
Collective
together,
unconscious.
yes,
like collective unconscious. Yeah.
yes.
But the unity is so complex. That's what we don't tend to think of. It's so intricate.
Yeah.
And there's such, you know, minute detail involved in it and so vast. But if you drill down those levels, the intricacy of the, you know, the spirals inside the spirals inside the spirals, you know.
The other thing I've been told is that we have no free will.
We have no
And
what?
there's a book by, I think by Sam Harris
Huh.
on that. I think that was the author.
Hmm.
And
What
it might be
was it,
worth a
Nina?
read.
That we have no free will.
We have no free will.
Mhm.
Well, or Jung said, I do that which I must.
Gladly. Free
Gladly.
will is doing that which I must gladly.
Gladly,
That's
you
like
know,
your
gladly
will.
means there's no resistance. And yeah. Gladly
you
means that
can-
whether it's if it's a duty or whatever it is, if there's no resistance, and in unity, there is no resistance because it's vast space inside. So there is no resistance. The resistance is of the mind.
Right.
But
But
internally,
that's
there
our
is-
experience. So it's kind of like, well, you can choose how you experience it. You can choose to go with the flow gladly, or you can.
no, you
choose-
don't even choose it. The work does it for you.
Right.
It's not, after a point, it's not a conscious choice. It's the work doing you.
Mhm.
You do the work for a while and then the work does you.
But at some point you made that choice.
Yeah, and I mean, I grapple with all of that myself because, you know, this year's training is completely on no self. Not that I haven't done it before, but this year's training that I just started about 3 weeks ago, all the meditations that are coming on are on no self. And maybe I'll see it, maybe I won't. I mean, who knows, you know? It reveals itself. You have no, that's where you know you have zero control.
Right. But
You
you
just-
show up.
You show up and you do the work. That's the only control you have.
But that's a lot. It
But
all
that
depends
doesn't
on
mean
that.
that you're going to get your answers.
Right, right. I'm not saying that, but I think you pretty much won't if you don't.
Yeah, you have to show
Yeah.
up and you have to do the work.
And and it takes decades to achieve, what someone like Ron did. And even then, there's no
Well, he
guarantee.
must have been doing it for a few lifetimes because it doesn't happen. I think what we can see in one lifetime is unity for sure. That is, I think, I know this because I've talked to enough teachers and enough people. I mean, I never thought I would ever see that. And I see it all the time. And if I can see it, I can tell you anybody and everybody can see it, period. But the rest of it, and when you see the unity, you see no self. You clearly see there is nobody there. It's just vastness of life. But how this person who this mind body is happening and there is no self, that is another level of it.
Yeah.
That's my son.
Okay, let's wrap it up.
An important delusion.
We'll see everybody
I'll
next
talk to you in
week.
5 minutes.
Okay,
Thank you, everybody.
okay, have a good, bye-bye.
Yeah, nice to see
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Namaste,
everybody.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.